Okay, so in this one, I'm going to walk you through a basic set of steps you can follow to maximize your chances of sitting down and then creating a good render versus sitting down and getting frustrated and not making something that's good. As a bit of context for how I learned this and why I'm including this in the course is because when I was learning 3D, and not just 3D, but also other things, like the same thing applies to like music production or just learning Photoshop or photography or anything. Something that I would struggle with a lot is I couldn't figure out why sometimes when I would sit down to create something, I would do it and it would be good and everything would go fine and I would get something cool at the end of it. But a lot of the times I would sit down and try and make something and it would just turn out like complete trash. And I did that a lot. And what I realized after doing it 1,000 times is that there's certain things you can do leading up to that process and during the process to really give yourself a better shot at creating something that's going to be good. And that's what this is going to be about, is how do you maximize your chance of sitting down and making something that's good versus, getting distracted or just not going in the direction you should be going, or it just turns out bad and you don't know why. So this is what this is about. So this is not a course on productivity, I realize that, but what I'm going to talk about here really is very, very important. This is a course about how to create the best renders possible. So I feel like I have to talk about this because this really is a very important step in creating the best render possible. So step 0 before you even get started is set aside a chunk of time that you're going to work on something. So ideally an hour or 2. The ideal situation, I know it's not always possible to do this, but the ideal situation is you have a solid 2 hours to just sit down and focus and have no distractions and not have anyone bother you or any things you have to do just outside of creating a render, and that's it. So it's not absolutely mandatory, but because life gets in the way sometimes, but if you can aim for that, that'll put you in a much better position to get something good. The next thing is try to minimize distractions as much as possible. So for me, this means like a lot of the times what I used to do, which I don't really do anymore, which was not good, was sit down to create a render and then put on a podcast or a video or something like that in the background just to make it a bit easier to get into it and more fun. But what happens is, I don't know, for whatever reason for me, that just, it's nicer and it's like more fun. But what I create is, I know for a fact it's never going to be as good as if I just have pure uninterrupted focus. And even if I put like the wrong type of music on, or I get distracted on Spotify, like searching for the right song, or especially having a podcast in the background that's interesting, it's more fun doing it that way because it's, listening to a podcast is nice, but it just, for some reason, doesn't allow me to fully get into the process. It just takes away from what I'm actually creating, and it just doesn't turn out as good. So that's just one example for me, but for you, that might be something else. So if you're like watching a video in the background or watching TV in the background, I'd highly recommend trying without that a few times and see if you can get into a deeper focus and create better work without that. Something you'll see in the process videos later on in the course is that this is something that I follow very strictly. I know for this it's like a bit different because I'm recording, I kind of have to be focused, but you'll see in the process videos, this is actually what I do even when I'm not recording, is just, an hour or 2 of just uninterrupted time where I'm just doing work and nothing else, not checking my phone, not watching a video. I take a break in those videos to go eat or something, like after an hour or something. That's totally fine, you can do that, but try to have like a good chunk of time and then take whatever break you need and then come back and have another good chunk of time. That's, I think, the best way to do it versus kind of half doing it where it's like you're working a bit, checking your phone, working a bit, watching TV, working a bit. Like having constant interruptions throughout the whole thing just seems to make it a lot harder to actually finish the thing, and it just doesn't turn out as good. And that's just speaking from experience of doing this many times and figuring out what seems to work best and what doesn't. Okay, so we haven't even talked about actually working on a render yet. This is just kind of what you do beforehand to make sure you're in the best position possible. So let's talk about what to actually do when you start creating something. So the first thing is, I wrote it as step 0, but I guess step 1. Before you even start is get at least a rough idea or plan of what you want to do, of what you want to accomplish during this session of work. So This is again something you'll see in the process videos later on in the course, but it's like in each one of those videos, I show you the idea that I have at the very beginning and then execute on that idea throughout the process. And so the reason this is important is because if you go in with no idea or sense of direction, or you don't know what you want to achieve during that session, it's a lot easier to spend a lot of time just trying to figure that out and like wasting time on, you're just going in kind of lost. It's like, it's so much more efficient. Things just go so much smoother if you have a rough plan, at least like the direction you want to go in when you sit down to create something. And you can imagine why. You know, if you go into Blender and you don't know what you want to do at all, it's all of a sudden this default scene here becomes a lot more intimidating, and it's like, it's a lot easier to just get stuck and sit there and go like, oh, I don't know what to do, and this is like not going well, and it's just, you get in your head and it's just not good. But if you have a rough plan to follow, you'll see this in those videos that are later on in the course. Like when I do it, it's like we're into Blender and we're just straight in creating something. There's no like, what should I do? It's just straight into the process of like making a thing. I love doing it that way because it's like, you open this up. If you have a rough plan going in, things just go so much smoother, and you just open up Blender, you get straight into it, and then things just flow from there. When you actually start working on something and you've, set aside some time, you've minimized all distractions, and you've got an idea, at least a rough, some, could be even just a basic shape or color you want to start with, some kind of direction to go in. Once you've done that, the way I like to approach this is start with, like when you open up the empty scene, start with something that is going to have the biggest effect on the overall image. So what that means is, some people will do, or sometimes I'll do a block out of the scene. So I'll know like, okay, say I sit down and I'm going to be making, I know I want to make like a cyberpunk environment, for example. What I'll do is maybe, for example, I will block out the scene by just setting up a camera. Could be all in solid view too, or wireframe or whatever, where you'll set up a camera, choose like a rough focal length, doesn't have to be the exact one you use. Add a ground plane, maybe add just some cubes around the scene and just say, okay, this cube, I'll turn that into a building later. This one will be some debris on the ground. This one will be a person standing here. And you just scale around basic blocks to create a rough outline of the thing you're going to create. And what happens is that will just give you an even better sense of the direction you need to go in. And it'll just make the process so much smoother. If you set up things like lighting first and some basic textures and the camera angle, all the things that are going to have the biggest impact on what the overall image is going to look like, versus if you start with like, designing some little wires that are going to be in the corner or some very intricate details that you'll use later. If you start with the bigger shapes that are going to have a bigger effect on what the actual thing looks like, that'll put you in a much better position to finish it and work on it efficiently than if you start with like some small details. And the reason is because if you get a sense of direction to go in early on, you'll just be more motivated. You'll be happier to work on it. Things will just flow better. You'll know where you need to go and what you need to do to finish this thing, versus if you, and trust me, I've done this many times and made this mistake many times, if you start with very small, intricate details and then trying to work backwards from there. Like, say I want to make, again, we'll use this example of a cyberpunk environment. Say I want to make a cyberpunk scene, and I start with creating some very intricate set of like wires on some like piece of futuristic tech or something. And I spend like 30 minutes modeling this thing, this tiny, like very intricately detailed thing that's not going to be like a main focus in the image. If I do that, the chance of me finishing the image is a lot lower. The chance of me just losing all hope and motivation like 40 minutes in is much, much higher if I start with that, because it's like, I just did all this very intense work. I just spent all this time creating this thing, and then you zoom out and you still have nothing. You still have one little piece of this thing you made, and then the overall picture is still nothing. And it's like, oh my God, I have so much work to do. I'm never going to finish this thing. Whereas if you just do a basic block out, you get some basic lighting, throw in, some kit bash models if you want. Now you're looking at something already. You're looking at the rendered view, and it's like, it looks like, something. And it just gives you a starting point, like a basic thing to work off of in it. It's like a plan, a map, a sense of direction of, okay, I know where I need to go from here now. Yeah, trust me, I've made that mistake many times. I've lost motivation just because I didn't start in the right order many times. And I think generally it just works out better if you start with those, again, just bigger block out shapes, or it could be bring in kit bash models and just use that as a block out, or just work on the thing that's going to have the biggest overall effect on the image. Could be a point of focus, like for example, in the first process video of the abandoned factory, what I started with in that one was actually modeling, but it was modeling the main thing in the image, which was the giant fan. So if you're gonna start with modeling or something like smaller detailed like that, it's okay if it's gonna be the main focus of the image, and it gives you that same sense of direction and starting point to work off of. Once you get that sense of direction to go in, and you've created a basic outline for yourself, then once you start working on it, after like 20-30 minutes, sometimes a bit more, an hour or something, you'll find that you'll get into this state where you've probably heard people talk about like flow states. You'll kind of enter this weird state where stuff just kind of happens, and it's almost like you're just watching it be put together, and you're not really thinking about what you're actually doing. It's just kind of all coming together and happening, and you're just watching this process happen. I know that sounds weird and kind of ethereal and just like, what? That's not very practical advice, but that is kind of how it works sometimes, is you just get into this state where stuff just kind of happens. That's the only way I can really explain it. And that's the ideal state to be in, because it's just, it just flows, and it just is a very beautiful thing to experience when you are just, you're putting it together, but it's almost like it's not even you that's doing it. So I know that sounds weird, but it is, that is the ideal state to reach when you're creating something. That's where the best stuff gets created for me. And the way you get there is just all the stuff in the beginning that I talked about, like minimize distractions, set aside time, don't be listening to a podcast, start with an idea, and then maximize your chance of getting to that state. That's really what you want to end up in, is that flow state where stuff's just kind of happening. Yeah, just to quickly recap all that. Step 1, minimize distractions and set aside some time. So 1 or 2 hours if possible. So if you set aside 2 hours, you don't have to use the full 2 hours, but if you have that time and you only use 1 hour, it takes the pressure off of like only having an hour. So if you can set aside more time, it's better, even if you don't use all of that time. So then, what I do is usually like work for an hour or so, take a break, go eat some food, go for a walk, whatever, go to the gym, come back, and then do another hour or so of focused work. Sometimes more, sometimes it's 2-3 hours in a row. It really depends on the day, but that's some rough numbers if you want numbers. And then step 2 is get a rough idea of what you want to do. So you set aside time. Now you get a rough idea. You could do that before. Sometimes it's you get an idea and then you set aside time. Sometimes it's set aside time and then brainstorm a little bit, or just go for a walk and get an idea. Then once you have an idea or a rough starting point to go off of, just a general theme to go off of, that'll make it much easier. So then once you have a basic idea like that, then start with blocking it out or making the main point of interest or whatever thing is going to have the biggest overall effect on the image. And then after you've done that, try your best to get into a flow state by, again, keeping those distractions minimized. Right now I'm working and my phone is not even in the room, and that helps me a lot. Just stay focused. And then, once you've done this block out and you're starting to work on now the medium and small details, then you'll find that you'll just naturally get into this flow state where stuff just kind of happens. And the process from there, once you have an idea and no distractions, is pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. You just kind of let it happen. So you don't always have to follow this step by step. In fact, most of the time you'll find that these steps kind of blur together, and like you'll start with maybe some more intricate pieces, and that's okay, and you kind of blend it together with the block out, and that's totally fine. Do whatever you need to do to, whatever works best for you. But for me, this is the most efficient way, and what I've showed you here is kind of like an average across all the things I've done of like what seems to work best. So it's not always going to be this exact step-by-step process, but this is like the rough outline of how it usually goes when it goes good. So yeah, if you are struggling with this problem of like when you sit down and then you create something and it turns out like garbage, try and follow this set of steps that I've given you here and see if that makes a difference for you. And chances are it will. I really think it will. Especially if you're someone who gets distracted easily, and you're checking your phone, you're listening to like podcasts in the background or watching videos while you're trying to work. Try without that. Try all the things I've showed you here. Try creating in that process, that set of steps that I've showed you of like, start with the biggest overall details, then move to medium, then move to small. Like gradually get to finer and finer details as you get further along in the process. And yeah, that'll put you in the right direction as efficiently as possible and maximize your chance of actually creating something that's really good. Okay, that's it for this one. Yeah, I'll see you in the next one.